For all its beauty and splendor, the wilderness can be a cruel teacher. Standing atop a hill after a long and grueling hike, it's easy to feel invincible. You've pushed yourself to your limits and survived nature's sometimes unpredictable conditions. Turns out, even the most trail-hardened can be caught unprepared and make simple beginner mistakes. Click the subscribe and like buttons. This is Outdoor Disasters. Considered one of the most beautiful national parks in the world, Yosemite is a paragon of the American wilderness. It's a place of formidable landscapes, breathtaking waterfalls, towering granite rock formations, ancient giant sequoias, and vast, unspoiled alpine wilderness. There's something gorgeous around every corner. Famed environmentalist John Muir once wrote, "It is by far the grandest of all the special temples of nature I was ever permitted to enter." Towering 3,500 feet above the Yosemite Valley floor, El Capitan is the undisputed king of the granite monoliths and a mecca for daredevil rock climbers. One of the West's most photographed landmarks, Half Dome inspires awe from every angle. Hardcore hikers can trek to its summit, or you can admire its sheared-off granite from afar. Whether you're looking for the adventure vacation of a lifetime, want to immerse yourself in the stillness of nature, or simply hike, backpack, or ski in one of the most beautiful places on Earth, you'll find your place in Yosemite. For one group of hikers, their Yosemite excursion would be one of the worst disasters in the park's history. Half Dome is a Yosemite icon and a great challenge to many hikers. Thousands of people reach the summit each year. For most, it is an exciting, arduous hike. For a few, it becomes more of an adventure than they wanted. Indeed, park rangers assist hundreds of people on the Half Dome Trail every summer. Much of the hike to Half Dome is an adventure into wilderness, and while there is nothing you can do to guarantee your safety, but that was the thrill co-workers and close friends Tom Rice and Adrian Esteban lived for. Regular outdoor companions, Tom Rice and Adrian Esteban headed a party that would attempt the 16-mile round-trip hike to summit Half Dome. Esteban had recruited another work friend, Bill Pippi, and his work supervisor, Bob Frith, to join. Frith, in turn, had invited his best friend, Bruce Weiner. Both were East Coast transplants and have recently arrived in California. Bill Pippi invited 16-year-old twin brothers, Bruce and Brian Jordan. Rounding out the group was co-worker Carl Buckner, who in turn invited his best friend, Steve Elner. The Rice-Esteban group awoke to a crystal-clear summer sky, ready for a full day of hiking to conquer the famed granite monolith. The caravan entered Yosemite Valley. Being Bruce Weiner's first time, he was awestruck by Yosemite Valley. The monstrous granite cliffs towered high over the valley like looming giants. Entering Yosemite Valley is breathtaking as you gaze up at the mile sheer from the valley floor. Then there it was, Half Dome and its distinct features. One side is a sheer face, while the other three sides are smooth and round, making it appear like a dome cut in half. It's the star of the valley, towering nearly 5,000 feet from the valley floor. Weiner had difficulty visualizing himself atop the overpowering mountain and wondered silently if he could really accomplish such a feat. They had a buffet breakfast at the cafeteria at Camp Curry, then loaded their backpacks with gear, clothing, and food. It was a 2-mile march to the trailhead at Happy Isles. The sky was blue when the group headed out, except for a single cumulus cloud floating above. By the time they reached Vernal Fall, a few cumuli of clouds had formed in the sky to the east. As the hike went on, Buckner and Elner fell behind and were a good 30 minutes behind the group. Rice, Esteban, Pippi, and the Jordan twins were ahead. Frith and Weiner arrived shortly after. Around 12:30 p.m. to cool off after a rigorous first half of the hike, they dove into the chill water upriver from Nevada Fall. They hooted, shouted, and yelled obscenities while tussling like schoolboys to push each other off. All the while, several cumulus clouds in the eastern skies now had combined and were massing over, and rumblings could be heard in the distance around Cloud's Rest. The threatening weather prompted Tom Rice and his party to pack up. Rice and Esteban assured the others once they were on the summit, they would be safe and dry in the cave if a thunderstorm hit. Pippi and Bruce Jordan were setting a furious pace, hoping to outrace the coming storm. Close behind, Tom Rice and Adrian Esteban made a quick stop at their secret spring. Brian Jordan soon joined them. Back at Nevada Falls, Weiner and Frith were falling behind. Carrying a 45-pound backpack, they'd been behind the other 5 for most of the trip. As exhausted as they were, they plodded ahead anyways. But as they went on, Weiner's muscles began to cramp. They gulped the last of their water. Weiner wanted to take a longer rest, but Frith urged him to push on and catch up with the others. Bill Pippy and Bruce Jordan were shooting to reach the top first. Both were competitive and in good shape. So despite the intimidating weather, the two raced ahead. Unfortunately for Pippy, he had an undeniable sensation to relieve himself of feces, so they headed back to find a place for Pippy. Esteban, Rice, and Brian Jordan were not far behind. As they were ascending, 2 hikers coming down warned them not to go up as the storm was coming. Rather, the warning enticed them to pick up the pace and reach the summit. Buckner and Elner were still very far behind, but continued plodding along, even after the threat of the lightning storm. Well ahead of their companions, Esteban and Rice reached the bottom of the cables at 5:40 p.m. as the dark clouds blanketed the sky. Lightning continued playing over the ridges and spires, and the thunder rumbled like battleship guns nearby. At the base of the cables, there's a sign warning hikers of ascending the mountain during a lightning storm. Half Dome is notorious for lightning strikes. Its smooth granite surface makes for an excellent conductor of electricity. They now had to weigh their next move. The threat of lightning would spur them on. At the top, they'd reach shelter in the form of a cave where they could hide from the storm. While a lightning bolt might possibly strike the granite slop near them, or even hit the cables they would be clinging to, a strike higher up was far more likely. What they didn't factor in was a strike could streak anywhere on wet surfaces. Any place on the mountain would be dangerous if Half Dome were coated with water. As Esteban looked up and analyzed the sky, he felt a drizzle on his face. Torrential rain wasn't far off. They figured this storm was no different from past hazards they have encountered over the years. The two exchanged a glance and knew the decision had been made. "Screw it, this is our mountain, let's just do it," Rice said. Esteban agreed. Despite the looming storm and the warning, they forged on and ascended the cables 600 feet away from the summit, shrouded in mist. Rice moved rapidly toward the cables, with Esteban immediately behind him. As if cued by their movements, a mosaic of jagged lightning streaked the sky, followed by rolling claps. A sense of foreboding overtook Esteban, which prompted him to say, "Whatever happens, I want you to know I love you." Meanwhile, Jordan split from the other group, content to hike at his own pace. Eager to impress the older men, he followed in Rice and Esteban's footsteps, without a second thought. Further back were Frith and Weiner. The warning sign at the base of the subdome stared at them as they approached the cables. A concerned Weiner wondered aloud if they should stop and wait out the storm. Frith assured him that refuge was in a cave that awaited them at the summit. He doubted he could make it up, but he figured his muscle would tighten further if he delayed further. As a newcomer, he didn't want to hold anyone back. They caught a glimpse of Rice and Esteban nearing the summit just as clouds unleashed pouring rain. Frith and Weiner put on their ponchos and began ascending the cables to the summit. As Rice and Esteban reached the summit around 6 p.m., they were still aware of their vulnerability. Lightning would strike the dome, it was only a matter of when. They dashed across the summit toward the cave. "We made it!" they yelled jubilantly and high-fived each other. Minutes later, they saw Brian Jordan standing at the summit. Esteban waved him urgently towards the cave. As Brian hustled over, Frith and Weiner appeared at the summit and waved them in as well. "Bring on the lightning show!" they yelled as they settled down in the cave. All were proud of what they had accomplished and were beaming with joy. At this time, the rain turned colder. Hailstones began clattering on the rocks. The 5 huddled inside the cave, looking to generate some heat. Meanwhile, Bill Pippy and Bruce Jordan had wisely stayed below subdome after Bruce said he was afraid of the lightning storm. Pippy, now dehydrated and severely weakened from diarrhea, they decided to head to base camp, where they pitched their tent and hunkered down at around 6:15 p.m. Back at the cave, the eerie lightning tracers glowed inside, casting ghostly hues. In an instant, the cave exploded with a cataclysmic roar as lightning ripped across its surfaces. Esteban was slammed against the wall. He screamed but didn't hear his voice. Everything grew dark. He was numb and couldn't move. Electricity had entered his body. Because he had limited contact with the granite, had confined the charge to the left side of his body, and was lucky he didn't get the full effect of the strike. Weiner was also lucky, bending to adjust his laces. He was only touching the wall with his rear and thighs, but he had no feeling from the waist down and was moaning in pain. But he was the most coherent of the group. Weiner turned to look at Brian Jordan, whose eyes were vacant. In shock, he says, "We've got to get out of here." Turning to scan the cave, he saw Rice slouch sideways against the granite wall in a fetal position with his body jerking and twitching. His bare legs were badly charred, and his blonde hair was blackened. As Esteban came to, he looked over at Brian Jordan, slumped forward, smelling of burning flesh. He appeared lifeless. With sickening clarity, Esteban now saw that he and Rice put everyone at risk. Pulling himself with his paralyzed legs behind, he was horrified at what he saw. Firth was vomiting and froth gurgling from his mouth, eyes rolled back and showing their whites. His forehead bore a gash as if someone had plunged a white-hot dagger into his skull. His body was thrashing and threatened to catapult himself off the ledge. Esteban managed to snag his waistband and pulled him back from the lip, but his body continued to convulse toward the edge as though he was seeking the void beyond. Esteban strained to hold on and yelled for help. Weiner, seeing his friend in peril, managed to grab Frith's sweater. Together, they pulled Frith back. But with both paralyzed from the waist down, they couldn't exert enough leverage. They couldn't control his violent convulsions and were in danger to go over the ledge as well. Weiner desperately held on as Esteban let go. Frith, convulsing, slid farther and was yanking Weiner closer to the edge as well. Weiner had no choice but to let go. In horror, he and Esteban watched as Frith disappeared over the precipice, to the rocks 2,200 feet below. Weiner screamed and began to sob. Devastated by the tragedy, Esteban looks over at Rice, whose left leg was twisted beneath a dislodged rock. He was making unintelligible noises and was gagging on regurgitated broccoli. He cleared his mouth and shook him in a vain attempt to restore consciousness. Severe burns scorched Rice's legs and were still smoking as atmospheric crackling sounded outside. Esteban was petrified and screamed to Weiner, "We've to get the hell out of here." Weiner tried to stand but fell back down. Esteban was convinced they were in mortal peril and could only think of escape. With all his upper body strength, he crawled his way to the tunnel entrance and onto the summit. His sights were set on a crevice called the outhouse that was about 150 feet away. Crawling frantically, he reached the depression. Giddy with relief, Esteban blended tears with shrill laughter as he was alive. And for the moment, that was all that mattered. Back at the cave, Weiner was shaken to the core by the disaster that had befallen him and his companions. He could have mustered enough strength to scramble out of the cave, but getting down the cable with an immobilized leg was unthinkable, and he wanted no part of being out there on the bare summit as a human lightning rod. So he prayed another strike wouldn't happen and stayed put. Buzzing and crackling suddenly filled the air. He had no time to budge before another blinding explosion blasted the granite and ripped through the cave. Weiner immediately found himself floating as he was having an out-of-body experience, watching his body convulse and then slowly sink into a relaxed state. He felt an excruciating pain in his chest. He lay motionless, the charred remnant of his shirt stuck to his exposed skin. Searing pain shot through his legs whenever he moved. The hiking boot on his left leg had been completely blown off. Rice gradually regained consciousness as if the jolt had recharged his brain. He screamed in agony from the weight of Weiner's body on his leg. Rice's other leg was bent grotesquely under a rock. Weiner rolled off him. Next to them was Brian Jordan, his face bluish, his body slumped over. Weiner began to yell for help. The clouds began to pass over, and only faint rumblings of thunder persisted from afar. In this part of Yosemite, the storm was over. Esteban, believing the danger had subsided, left the crevice and began crawling back up to the slope toward the cave. Esteban saw someone coming over the ridge at the top of the cables. He waved his arms to attract the hiker's attention. This hiker was Mike Hoog, who was a trained EMT. As Hoog entered the cave, he saw the disaster that engulfed the hiking party. The odor of burned hair and flesh hung in the air. He scurried over the worst off, who was Brian Jordan. He had no pulse and was dead. He then attended to Rice and Weiner. Esteban, who now had full use of his legs, approached the cave to assist. When Rice saw him, he yelled, "Adrian, get your ass in here and get me out. Don't leave me behind to die like you did." Hug and Esteban carried the two out of the cave onto the open granite and laid them on the ground, both moaning and squirming in pain. Others from the group Hug was hiking with made it up to the summit and assisted the injured hiker, which included Linda Cozier, an EMT trainer. Confident Linda and the others could handle injured Rice and Weiner, Hogg figured that him being a long-distance runner should be the person to run for help. With the storm past, Pippi and Bruce Jordan were ready to make their ascent and were back at the cables. Carl Buckner and Steve Elner finally arrived at the cables as well. They regrouped and repacked their backpacks and were beginning to start their ascent when they encountered a frenzied Hug dashing down. Hikers had been hit by lightning up on top. "I'm going for help," he blurted out. "That's it, I'm not going any farther, I'm out of here," Elner said. He headed back down. Pippi initially thought the hiker meant the strike had occurred some time ago and refused to believe the incident involved anyone in his group. "I simply blocked that notion out of my mind," he later stated. On the cables, they encountered another hurried hiker coming down. Two guys got killed and one was a young kid. Those words stunned Buckner, Pippi, and Bruce Jordan, thinking it could have been Bruce's brother who was killed. In silence, the three continued their climb, the full weight of the unfolding tragedy now hanging over them. As Pippi, Buckner, and Jordan arrived at the summit, they saw Rice. Rice shouted, "The kid's dead. Frith fell over the edge." When Buckner heard this, he couldn't handle it, so he retreated down the cables to the base camp to meet Elner. They didn't sleep much as each attempted to digest the horrifying news about their comrades. As Pippi and Bruce Jordan reached others, Pippi was in disbelief. Bruce just stared blankly as if the reality of his deceased brother hadn't hit him yet. It was 8:45 p.m. and darkness was settling over Yosemite Valley. All the activity of caring for the injured hikers was happening just feet from the precipice of the sheer rock face of Half Dome. Linda Cozier was leading the triage on top of the summit, trying desperately to attend to Weiner and Rice's injuries as best as she could. Pippi was inconsolable as he felt guilty for the death of Brian, who was in his care. Around 9:30 p.m., Mike Hug reached a ranger station and informed them of the situation unfolding on top of Half Dome. The rangers packed up their supplies and headed up to Half Dome on foot. While a helicopter was considered, it was dark and very dangerous for flying at low altitudes. Without sufficient moonlight, it wouldn't be possible. But around 11 p.m., the moonlight broke through, spurring the rangers to dispatch a helicopter from Modesto. As the rangers who were on foot reached the summit of Half Dome, they were briefed about the situation by Linda. The group was informed about the coming helicopter and set out to find a suitable landing zone on the summit. Just around midnight, the unmistakable sound of helicopter rotor blades grew louder and louder. The rangers gathered flashlights and used them as an LZ marker, positioning them in a circle. Time was crucial for the rescue, as if the moonlight vanished, the helicopter might be stuck on the summit overnight. As the helicopter reached the summit, it could only take one patient at a time. It was decided that Weiner was the worse off and needed immediate attention, and was the first to be evacuated down to the valley. Around 1:15 a.m., the helicopter returned for Rice, and he also was flown down. And the last person to be evacuated was Esteban, who didn't need a stretcher like the other two. It was determined Rice and Weiner's injuries required specialized care at a major trauma center and were flown to UC Davis Medical Center. Back on the summit of Half Dome, the remaining hikers were spent mentally, physically, and psychologically. There was a strong sense of cohesiveness and mutual affection amongst the group, including the other hikers that stepped in to assist. Remaining on the summit from the Esteban Rice party were Bill Pippi and Bruce Jordan, who was battling with despair as the body of Brian lay in the cave just feet away. Linda Cozier, Mike Hug, and their party remained on the summit as well. Around 6:30 a.m., a Yosemite National Park helicopter lifted off to retrieve the bodies of Bob Rith and Brian Jordan. They flew to the base of Half Dome and located Frith among the rocks, then flew to the summit to retrieve the body of Brian Jordan. Bruce got in the helicopter with the body of his brother. Shortly after, Pippi hiked down to where Carl Buckner and Steve Elner were camping, and the three trudged back down to the valley. When Pippi arrived at the ranger station, Bruce and Brian's parents were there, which made Pippi again inconsolable as he broke down crying. Mr. Jordan's attempts to comfort Bill Pippi helped him considerably. Unaware of the events that led to the tragedy, the Jordans held Yosemite officials responsible for the disaster at Half Dome and wondered how they allowed hikers to scale Half Dome despite the hazardous weather. Linda Crozier and another member of her party, Brian Cage, gave their statements to the Rangers on what occurred. Cage stated, "That's when it really hit me. As much as this was an accident caused by a combination of Mother Nature and poor human judgment, there remained a looming wrongful death lawsuit against Yosemite. I remember the ranger commenting that a big money lawsuit could easily consume the entire budget, the park-a-lots for making Half Dome, and other backcountry destinations accessible." Cage told the ranger they were prepared to testify that the accident happened because the 5 men in the cave had been reckless. Esteban himself had stated as much, so the Jordans were advised to not pursue a lawsuit, as it would likely be dismissed. Esteban struggled with the fact his and Rice's action caused the death of 2 people and 1 is seriously injured. He also struggled with the accusation by Rice that he abandoned him. "The dilemma I faced, do all I could to save someone else and let myself possibly die, or save myself and let someone else possibly die," he said. Fleeing the cave for safety of the 5 hikers, he endured the catastrophe with no major injuries. While thankful, the guilt nevertheless overwhelmed him. He sank into a deep depression and nightmares of Frith toppling off the edge. Tom Rice and Bruce Weiner were hospitalized at UC Davis Medical Center, where both were in critical condition. Bruce spent 3 weeks or so at UC Davis and then was shipped home to Boston, where he stayed in the hospital in a burn unit. He had suffered major kidney damage and required a lot of skin grafts. Unfortunately for him, his grafts got infected and needed to be ripped off and replaced, a process Bruce says was worse than actually getting hit. Bruce lost over 70 pounds while he was bedridden. Unfortunately, most of that weight was muscle, which he had to gain all the way back so he could do fun things like walk correctly again. To this day, Bruce still has muscle loss from the experience. There is permanent nerve damage that he'll likely deal with for the rest of his life. He also has some lingering kidney problems. To this day, the lightning strike won't even let him pee normally. When Weiner reflects on what happened more than 30 years later, he is grateful. The people that took care of us rescued us and got us out of the cave and looked after us for all those hours until the helicopter came. They didn't know us. They just took it upon themselves to be there and never asked for anything. I'm always going to be very grateful. He also said it was reckless and irresponsible for the experienced leaders of the group, Rice and Esteban, to tell outdoor rookies like him and Frith that there was a safe haven on the summit in the event of a lightning storm. In reality, it was the least safe place we could have chosen to be at that moment, short of standing on top of that mountain with a big lightning rod in our hands, which is essentially what we were doing. But he also takes responsibility for his own ignorance and the dangerous situation it led him to, along with the self-imposed pressure and peer pressure to reach the summit. It was my responsibility to look out for myself and be smart. Ultimately, we made the decision and no one held a gun to our heads. Tom Rice was in the intensive care unit for weeks and had severe burns on his legs. He resented the fact that Esteban hadn't suffered any injuries and lambasted him for leaving. Esteban stormed out. Linda Crozier, the hiker who stepped in as the lead nurse on the summit, visited Rice many times during his hospital stay in Davis. He made a full recovery months later. The very next summer, Esteban, Rice, and Pippi returned to Half Dome Summit. "We had to prove to ourselves we can do this," Rice stated. Adrian Esteban returned many times to Half Dome as it continued to serve as a barometer of his physical and mental well-being. The rock chamber, however, became a sacred place to not be disturbed, and stayed away from the enclosure during his ascents. Of all the weather-related phenomena, lightning kills and injures more people than any other, with the exception of floods. The outdoors is the most dangerous place to be during a lightning storm. If you're in a storm, the only way to avoid lightning is to find a large enclosed shelter. In a shelter, avoid contact with objects that conduct electricity, such as computers, corded phones, metal items, or large amounts of concrete. If in a car, roll up the windows and don't lean against the inside doors. Wait at least 30 minutes from the last thunderclap before leaving the shelter. It may seem counterintuitive, but don't seek shelter under cliffs, caves, mine entrances, or trees, all of which could put you at greater risk if you are struck by lightning. Small structures like these provide nearly zero protection as they lack a grounding mechanism. Instead, aim to ensure that there is higher ground above you. If caught outside, avoid bodies of water, high ground, and open spaces. The summit of a peak is the last place you want to be, as lightning always wants to travel the shortest distance possible. If in a forest, retreat to smaller trees surrounded by taller ones. If outdoors and in an open area, seek the lowest point and be the lowest point, and make yourself the smallest target possible by standing on an insulating item like a backpack, placing your heels close together and crouching. Do not lie down. If you do get caught in a storm, then the general advice is to descend as quickly as is safely possible. The higher and more exposed you are, the greater the danger. Important information so you can avoid an outdoor disaster.